Chapter 18. The Seven Sisters of the Underworld. Abaddon stacked a pile of candles around him on the table as he dove deeper into the Devil's Bible. Hours went by as Abaddon went over each page, front to back, from cover to cover. The candles had melted to the table over that time, and were now burning so low the room was almost dark. There was a red-hot ball of coals covered in white ash only left now. Abaddon got up and threw 5 more logs into the pit, stirring up the coals and igniting the logs on fire. Before Abaddon went to his seat, he made his way to the window on the right side of the room, picking up the 6 candles that were sitting there. As he walked back to the table, the fire had lit the room up, its yellow-orange glow filling the room. Abaddon walked back over to the long table and set the candles next to the old ones. He used one of the still-lit candles to light the new ones before he tossed the used ones in the fire pit from his seat. Marcus's door creaked as he opened it. The clunking of his staff on the floor echoed through the room. Abaddon smiled at the sound of the staff. He enjoyed Marcus's company. Marcus leaned his staff against the table as he took his seat, nodded his head, and said, "Good morning, Hell Knight." Abaddon took his seat as he replied, "Good morning, my friend. How did you sleep?" Marcus adjusted the bench before replying, "Like a baby on a feather pillow." About that time, Judy and the children came over and sat at the table, setting drinks down in front of Marcus and Abaddon. They both thanked her before taking a drink. Judy sent her son, James, to wake Azrael, as she and her daughter went back to the kitchen. Judy, Amanda, and James made 4 trips back and forth, filling the table with food and drink. Azrael walked around the corner and took a seat at the head of the table. The family chatted all through the meal, filling their bellies. As things wound down and the meal came to an end, they all cleaned up the table as Judy and the children went off to do the morning chores. Abaddon and Azrael went over to the bar, bringing back 3 mugs and taking their seats at the long oak table. Abaddon slid the mug down the table to Marcus. The mug had pushed his arm back when it hit his palm, and as his elbow slid back, it touched the red crystal, sending him into a vision. Marcus's eyes went blood red as his body went stiff. His mouth dropped open, and red sand came pouring out onto the table. Marcus exhaled 2 columns of gray and black smoke on the table from his nostrils. The 2 clouds floated forward as they transformed. The gray cloud had formed into Lilith. She had fallen to her knees. The black cloud formed into an archangel who towered over Lilith as if she was a child. He must have been 13 feet tall, with hair down to his waist. It was black at the top, then turned bright red halfway down. Upon his forehead sat a pair of ivory white ram's horns. The skin on his backside was burnt and cracked like charcoal from a fire. His marble feathers were burnt black and cracked from the massive amount of heat. A bright blue liquid outlined his charred feathers. Some of the blue liquid poured over into the cracks as well. The front of him was a bright red, and from his face to his stomach was covered in small black blisters and partially melted skin, with a scar across his neck on his left side. The scar was wide and deep, taking up most of the neck on his left side. A scar to the right side of his face ran from the top of his forehead down the middle of his eye, finishing all the way to his jaw. The Archangel's damaged eye was solid white and had a bright blue pupil. His left eye was solid black, with a bright red pupil. Lilith was still on her knees, trembling with fear, as tears of blood ran down her cheeks. Her head was bowed. She could hear the dirt and rocks crunch under his boots as he shifted his weight. He spoke with the voice of a dragon. "Why have you stolen from me?" Lilith flinched at the sound of his voice, and she spoke with a trembling one.
"Please forgive me, Lord Lucifer. I did not know that they were yours."
Shifting his weight and cracking his neck before he spoke. "Silence!
You will pay for what you have done. But for now, I have something I want you to do. Take my Bible and use the black magic within it to make me 7 daughters. Do not mistake my kindness for a weakness. Now go!"
Lilith jumped back, shaking in terror as she scrambled to the sky. Lucifer stood, watching Lilith grow smaller into the distance, before he snapped his fingers, sending a massive red lightning bolt crashing down upon her. He laughed deeply under his breath as he turned and walked away. Lilith woke up tangled up in a large old redwood tree, with blisters and charred parts of skin still smoldering from the lightning blast she just received. Lilith cried in pain and anger as she struggled to free herself from the giant redwood. A long, thin branch was stuck through her left thigh, and 2 more thicker branches had punctured her wings, pinning her down. Lilith's eyes began to glow a bright red, with tears of blood running down her face. Her screams of rage and agony were heard for miles. The forest below hushed with silence as the animals scurried off deeper into the forest to hide. The echo of Lilith's voice traveled so far that it caught the attention of Lucifer. He had stopped and pushed off the ground softly as he ascended 14 feet in the air. He looked back in the direction the screams came from, to see a bright red glow coming from the trees in the distance. With a wide grin, Lucifer spoke with a voice like a dragon.
"This is only the start of your suffering, little sister."
Their view zoomed back to Lilith, still struggling to free herself from the redwood. She twisted her left leg, snapping the branch off the tree, but still leaving it through her thigh. Pushing up with her right leg and extending her arms above her head, the holes in her wings stretched and tore as she finally reached the branches, breaking them off so she could move. Lilith reached out in front of her, grabbing a hold of the closest branch and pulling herself to her feet. She could not bear much weight on her left leg. Blood ran down her thigh. As she pushed off with her right leg, Lilith had problems getting into and staying in the air. Lilith struggled for over an hour with hurricane winds and ice-cold rain hindering her flight. The holes in her wings had doubled in size due to the strong winds she endured. Lilith was fading fast, dropping lower and lower, finally losing the strength to go on. Falling to the courtyard of her castle below, Lilith slammed into the cobblestone, sliding 2 feet from the open door that led to the great hall. The rain was coming down heavily, which made it easier for Lilith to pull herself out of the courtyard and into the entryway of the castle. Lilith had pulled herself into the great hall, where she had stored 2 bodies full of fresh blood. She consumed as much blood as she could to make the healing process move along faster. Lilith grasped at the 8-inch long and 3-inch round branch protruding from her thigh and pulled hard 2 times to finally remove it. Blood squirted over a foot onto the floor in front of her. Lilith gathered her strength over the next 2 nights, draining the blood of the animals in the forest. The 3rd night, Lilith began reading over the Devil's Bible. She came across a chapter called The Perfect Demon. The writing was done in red ink, and the chapter went as follows. You will need a freshly dead corpse, black nightshade berries, a bat's heart, demon blood, and a bag of hell sand. Mix all the ingredients into a bowl, then cut open the chest and pour the mixture into their hearts. This process can take time, upward of 6 days for the corpse to reanimate, but a lightning strike will animate them instantly. The sun will incinerate them if they are in it for too long. Holy items will harm and or kill them as well. Lilith closed the book and placed it on a shelf that rested between 2 large curved staircases before heading to the forest to collect her nightshade berries. Lilith tossed a basket with a lid and 2 leather straps with a coin purse that hung from the basket strap. With her wings still not healed all the way, she would be walking on this full moon night. Lucky for her, she did not have to venture too far into the forest. The nightshade berries were the first items she came across, filling her leather coin purse and tying the pouch off before hooking it back onto the strap. Throwing the basket back over her shoulder and walking off just a little deeper into the forest, she stopped under a canopy, dropping to one knee and setting the basket on the soft green grass gently. Lilith made a soft clicking sound from her mouth that vibrated under the canopy of trees. 10 or so bats fell into her basket. Standing up, she threw the basket back over her shoulder and walked back to the castle with a slight limp. As she entered the great hall, it was dimly lit with few candles and a small fire in the center of the floor. She had collapsed next to the fire. She opened the basket and pulled out 2 bats and sucked them dry. As Lilith warmed up and with her thirst quenched, she passed out on the stone floor in front of the fire. Lilith had woken 2 nights later with the holes in her wings healed and her thigh still having a thumb-sized hole in it. Lilith was going back through the chapter of the perfect demon, making sure she had it right. As she read down the 2nd page, she noticed that the 3rd page was stuck to the 2nd page. She carefully peeled them apart, revealing a note to Lilith from Lucifer. "Gather 7 trapping crystals. You will need them." With a deep sigh, she went over to the table by the window on the right side of the room, reaching under it and pulling a black crystal ball from the basket and placing it on the table as the half-moon's glow surrounded it. As she leaned forward, scooping up the large black crystal ball and bringing it closer to her face, Lilith spoke with a whisper. "Where are the crystals I seek?" Red lightning began streaking across the crystal ball. The clouds within it parted, opening up over a cave in a crescent cove. Lilith placed the crystal ball back under the table and into the basket. She grabbed the handpick that was leaning against the wall next to the table. She slipped it into her belt loop as she walked out to the courtyard, taking to the sky and heading east toward Crescent Cove. This time her travels were not met by any bad weather, and Lilith made it to the beach, landing softly as her toes were buried in the sand. The waves rolled over her feet, sending a cold chill up her leg, as the mist of the sea sprayed across Lilith's upper chest and neck, leaving dew upon her that sparkled in the moonlight. Struggling to walk in the soft sand, she made it to the large cave opening. The cave was not very deep, but it was much darker than she would have thought. She had a hard time seeing even though she could see in the dark. Not looking where she was going, Lilith kicked a large log that had drifted up onto the shore. A large branch stuck out of the trunk of the driftwood. It was very dry, and must have been there for some time. Lilith snapped the dry, dead branch off and raised it to her mouth. She began speaking in Latin and in a demon tongue, closing her eyes as she blew on the end of the branch. Smoke started pouring out the end as it began glowing bright red that shone off Lilith's face. Lilith gave one last fast gust of air from her lungs that ignited the branch. The orange flames flickered across the cave, bringing life and sparkle to the cave, full of beautiful crystals. Lilith jammed the torch into a crevice in the wall and began collecting the 7 crystals she needed. This took her longer than she expected. She was weaker than she had anticipated. Shaking and drenched in sweat, Lilith finally got the 7th crystal, placing it in the leather shoulder bag with the rest of them. She struggled under the weight of the bag, but was still able to make it back. Gasping and breathing heavily, she descended to her courtyard of her castle, setting the large bag down on the cobblestone steps, propping it against the thick oak doors. Lilith dragged the bag into the great hall and placed it next to the table under the window. Lilith began making a pentagram on the floor with a piece of coal she grabbed from the edge of her small fire pit. She placed 5 black candles around the sigil and lit them with a stick from the fire. Lilith pulled a bat out of the basket, ripped off its head, and placed it in the center of the pentagram. She spoke once more in a demonic tongue, the castle beginning to shake and to tremble as she kept speaking. The floor opened up, spewing forth ash, brimstone, and thick clouds of smoke. Wailing and screaming poured out into the great hall that put Lilith to her knees. The hellmouth closed itself up, and as the smoke settled, 4 columns of floating black hell sand now faced Lilith. Their eyes burned red like hellfire, and their teeth were as razors and looked to be made of ivory. The 4 columns of floating hell sand lowered to the ground and took the shape of a human's body as they bowed to Lilith. The black figure to the far left stepped forward and spoke with a deep, echoing voice. "Thank you for freeing us from the pit. How can we serve you, Master?" Lilith stepped forward as she said, "I need you to take over the village east of here by the name of Brasov. My children will need food. Leave me some of your hell sand. I will need that as well." All 4 of the demons nodded their heads, and then shaking some of their hell sand onto the floor in 4 piles. The 4 demons then turned, took to the air, and left the castle, heading east as they were instructed. Lilith collected the hell sand into 2 terracotta pots and set them next to the table before sitting down and putting the black crystal back on the table. Lilith searched extensively with her crystal ball for over a month, till one night, when there was a lunar eclipse, the crystal ball showed Lilith a pregnant witch hanging from a pine tree outside of a cottage next to a small patch of woods. Black clouds filled the crystal ball as a map became visible across the clouds with a large red dot appearing on the map a good ways away from her castle, northwest next to a large mountain range. Lilith rested now and would leave at nightfall. Lilith woke as the sun was setting. A colony of bats swarmed past her, and she reached out to grab some breakfast. Lilith drained the 2 bats she had, throwing them to the stone floor, their furry, rat-like bodies squirting blood from puncture wounds into a stream across the stone floor. The bag of crystals caught her eye, so she walked over and dragged the bag over between the 2 staircases. Lilith reached up on the side of the wall and pulled the torch holder down. The ground shook lightly as a section of the wall started to drop to the floor. As she waited for the door, the Devil's Bible caught her eye as well. Not realizing that she had spoken out loud till she heard her own voice echo through the great hall. "If I lose that, Lucifer will skin me alive." She put her brother's book on the bookshelf by the stairs, and then pulled the torch holder, closing it up as she made her way out to the courtyard, taking to the night sky and off into the night. The night sky was cool and clear, and every star and planet shone against the black night sky. The full moon's bright glow lit her way as it hung in the heavens. Lilith traveled for 2 hours before seeing the cottage on the horizon. As she came closer and closer, the cottage and massive black oak tree became easier to see. Lilith landed harder than she thought she should have, and with much more noise than she would have liked. Landing 6 feet from the huge oak tree, there, on one of the lower branches, was a noose tied to a branch, with the wretched face of an old wrinkly witch's head still hanging with her spine hanging down through the noose's hole. Blood was still dripping from the spinal cord. Her hair was coarse like straw and white as snow down to her knees. Her mouth was hanging wide open, with flies crawling in and out of it, and her eyes had rolled into the back of her head. Her body had fallen, her legs bent backward and pinned under her large bottom. A pool of blood rested on the ground under her neck as her pregnant belly protruded from her body. Lilith walked over and knelt down next to the witch's body. Taking one long red claw and slicing her ragged dress open, exposing her large belly, Lilith cut into the witch's stomach, having to cut into it 3 times with her long claw before she removed the intestine. Lilith reached in, dragging the rest of her insides out to the ground as it slid off the tops of her thighs. Lilith was covered in blood, mucus, and entrails as she cut into the amniotic sac, spilling fluid everywhere. Lilith was now elbow-deep in the witch's belly. She was digging the dead fetuses out one by one till the large sack was full. Lilith struggled immensely as she took to the sky with the large sack hanging over her back. The moon silhouetted Lilith all the way back to her castle, landing clumsily in the courtyard below. She had dropped the bag, spilling the fetuses across the stone courtyard. They had just become too heavy to hold on to. Lilith slammed into the stone courtyard, splitting her skull open and passing out. Lilith was out for so long that the sun was cresting over the mountain as the rays of brilliant light crept up to her knees. When she woke, she was screaming in agony as the warm sunlight began burning and melting her skin. The smell of melting flesh gagged even her, and she shuffled backward like a crab, hiding in the nearby shadow of a large oak tree that was on the far right of the courtyard. Lilith used almost all of her strength to gather the 3 fetuses off the ground and placing them back in the sack as she dragged it into the great hall. She was limping once more, as smoke came from her wounds and her skin dripped onto the cold floor. Lilith slept for the rest of the day, waking just as the pink sun was setting on the horizon. Lilith's burns had healed for the most part, but she still limped slightly. She started dragging the large bag to the dungeon, leaving the great hall and taking a right at the corner. She was now headed down a long, dark hallway with no windows, but tapestries and paintings hung on the stone walls as a cold gust of wind rushed past her, blowing her hair all in her face. She came to a T at the end of the hall. She remembered she forgot the ingredients. She would have to come back for the bag of crystals anyway. Dragging the sack around the corner to the left, she only went a short distance down the hallway before leaning the sack against the wall and pulling a torch holder, revealing a secret door. Pulling the cloth-wrapped torch from the holder, chanting in Latin, and then blowing on it ignited the cloth into an orange flame. The light flickered as Lilith dragged the heavy, wet sack down the dark staircase. As the orange light flickered across the walls, she descended into the dungeon. As Lilith came off the last step, her feet sank into fine, soft sand that circled around a large stone semicircular fire pit. Lilith set the sack on the soft sand and then walked over to the fire pit, lighting the timber within, enveloping the dungeon in a warm orange light. Lilith had dragged the dirty, large sack about 5 feet forward, dumping the fetuses in a pile upon the sand. She laid them out, one by one, across the sand upon their backs. Lilith hurried back upstairs, grabbing the basket of ingredients, 7 bags of hell sand, and the bats before struggling all the way back down to the dungeon. She laid the bag of crystals on the wood table that was set against the wall on the left side of the room, before dragging the ingredient bag and caged bats over to the half-moon fire pit. Placing 1 black nightshade berry into each bowl, then the bats' hearts, along with some of her own blood, and finally the hell sand. The hell sand melted the ingredients together as she stirred each one with her long red claw, licking the residue off with her tongue. Lilith smiled widely as she set a bowl next to each fetus as she went down the line, cutting open their tiny chests. The 7 sisters were small, with bluish, translucent skin. Lilith could see the blue veins and the muscle structure through their skin. Their eyes were white and milky as if they were blind. Their lips were dark purple. She poured out each bowl into each one of their chest cavities, onto their hearts. She needed to let it set in, so she went back upstairs and brought the black crystal ball back down with her. Placing herself above their heads and holding the black crystal ball high above them, she started chanting in Latin, and the crystal began to float over them. She kept an even pace as she grew louder in volume, black clouds pouring out and filling the ceiling as red lightning struck the ground, leaving burn marks and small chunks of glass in the sand. A thick bolt of lightning struck the first child and proceeded to arch down, connecting them all at once. As the clouds filled the crystal ball, it lowered softly into her hands. She placed it on the sand. It sank into it, being cradled. The children had already grown from infants and toddlers. The children stumbled around, giggling as babies do. It had only taken 2 weeks of bodies to grow them into their late teens. Lilith gathered the girls into the great hall between the 2 staircases, with the crystals set out in a circle onto the wooden table in the middle of the room. The sisters looked very similar to Lilith, milky white skin with long red claws. Their lips, wings, and hair, which was down to their lower backs, was purple. The sisters gathered around the table, each standing in front of each one of the crystals. Lilith pulled out her crystal ball and set it in the middle of the table. "Okay, girls, grab a hold of your crystals." As Lilith began chanting in Latin, the black crystal ball started to float above the center of the table. The black cloud poured out once more, filling the ceiling with dark gray clouds. Lilith raised her arms and spoke one different word in Latin than she had before, and with that word, red lightning struck the sisters. It shocked them for a good minute before they turned to purple sand that was sucked into the crystals. The cloud reverted back into the crystal ball as the lightning crawled back into as well. With the crystal ball and the now purple crystals piled in her arms, she took them upstairs, putting the crystal ball under the table and placing the purple crystals into her secret hidey hole. She put the Devil's Bible into a chest and locked it up. Lilith could hear muffled talking as 5 male versions of her came into the great hall.
"Lilith, your brother has a message for you."
Chapter